I am going to invite Dr. Andrew Weimer to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Dr. DeShane. So it's my pleasure to introduce the Reverend Dr. Karyn L. Wiseman, the Herman G. Stumpfel Associate Professor of Homiletics at United Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia and lead pastor of Gloria Dei Church in Huntingdon Valley, Pennsylvania. Dr. Wiseman holds a PhD from Drew University, a Druid, and is an ordained pastor in the United Church of Christ. I encourage you to look at her bio that is included in the program announcement for more details about her many accomplishments. I do want to add some subtext to Dr. Wiseman's bio. Dr. Wiseman has been engaging digital media in the context of worship and preaching for many years prior to the pandemic. And she has been a go-to person in our field in this area for some time. And one more bit of subtext to Dr. Wiseman's distinguished bio. Ever since I was a PhD student, I have been so grateful for Dr. Wiseman's gracious collegiality, humility, and accessibility. And I know that you will find her presence and insight of great value. So welcome, Dr. Wiseman.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here today with you all. I thank the organizing committee and all of the folks who've been a part of this. It is always a pleasure to be able to talk to colleagues, to talk to students and pastors, and to sort of share what's going on right now. One of the things that I want to just sort of start with is we're in a situation that is unlike any that we have known before. When we've had other pandemics like flu in the early part of the 1900s, we didn't have the accessibility of information and being able to connect to one another through so many digital avenues. And so we've been able to sort of maintain connection and to continue to preach and to pray together and to have small group activities, unlike a lot of times in our world. One of the things that was really amazing early on for my church in particular, and I know for many others, is that you already had a digital presence, either on Facebook or Twitter, maybe on an Instagram account, maybe you were already live streaming on your Facebook account or on your website, maybe you were, recording your services and putting them up to YouTube. For those churches, the sort of pivot that needed to be made in March of 2020 was a little bit easier. But there were a lot of congregations out there that really did not have the capacity in their current configuration to go virtual, to have a digital presence. And there was a lot of scrambling early on. I know in my Facebook feed, I kept seeing pastors that were like, okay, what video do I use? And what kind of mic do you use? And how much setup do I need? And people going on and talking about the new setups that they had bought or the new, apparatus or new platforms that they were beginning to use. And they had to pivot pretty hard. If you think of the word pivot, there is this central point, right? And then around that pivot is how things sort of access and move. And for all of us, whether we were continuing the use of a lot of the digital and virtual formats we already had, or we were having to come up with new formats and new technology and new apparatus to make it happen, we were pivoting around that central axis of worshiping the God who is, of worshiping the God that is with us in our homes on Sunday morning or in the car ride as we're listening to the audio recordings, or the ways that that people were just finding moments to gather and worship together. And that pivot, no matter whether it was easy for you or more difficult for you, that's a rough move. It's a rough move from having people sitting in your pews and participating in the readings of the day. It's a tough pivot from sitting and being at home recording a sermon before, Thursday or Friday to get it edited into a virtual service that you're going to upload to your folks on Sunday. It is an extremely different pivot for preaching. Most of us are absolutely already used to the interaction that you have with a congregation. They're sitting there, you say something and they react to it. Maybe it's humor and you get a chuckle or two. Maybe it is the reality of the pain of the situation and the isolation that people are feeling. And you get this response to that. And for a lot of our preaching over the last year, and it is indeed just a week from the 1 year mark when Pennsylvania, where I live in Montgomery County, shut things down for a couple of weeks to sort of flatten the curve. A year of finding new ways to gather and new options for worship that in its very reality is exhausting. But we do this work because we are trying to proclaim the good news of Christ, the love and grace of God, and the power of the Holy Spirit to engage us no matter where we are, right? And that's powerful. That's important. But, one of the things that I'm not used to yet, after 52 weeks almost, is preaching in a sanctuary that is virtually empty. Our church has a large space, but we have a constituency that, from all different walks of life, some of them struggle with being in close proximity to others who might be sick. We have a lot of folks that have underlying health conditions, as many of you do, and families with small children who weren't sure if they wanted their kids in school on a weekly basis, let alone in a worship service where we were sitting too closely. So to go from a sanctuary where people are interacting with you, sometimes in spoken word, to sort of do a shared sermon dialogue. Hey, we're talking today about the communion service, the Lord's Supper. And I'm just wondering, if you could set out the most perfect buffet for God's world, what would you put on it? And having people sort of ping and respond to you. All of that stuff has changed. And so preaching to an empty sanctuary where we used to have hundreds of people sit has been a real journey. I do better some days than others. Sometimes I am listening to the music as our musicians play live as I'm about to preach. And I get a tear in my eye because I know where the Smiths typically sit on this side. And I know the Deutschleys are always right there. And I know that this third row is where the Hannemans sit. And their kids are always a little bit loud, but they sit up front because the kids want to be able to be as close as possible to the music. And I know where those last row people are, right? And that's important for us to acknowledge that there's some grief in losing that. There's some grief in having to pivot so radically to this new world. And, as Andrew was talking about earlier, they started visioning in 2018, how is worship going to look in the future? And as he said, they didn't envision this, but this is where we are. And not only is this where we are right now, but we may be in a hybrid or virtual or, collaborative sort of worship environment for years to come. There are some people who will never come back to in-person worship. We just have to acknowledge that. And there are others who will come back, but be very reticent to participate in things. And we have people who are so ready to get back, they will do anything to crawl and scratch their way into the building to be in that worship space. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about today is how do we make our preaching in my time with you today, how do we make our preaching as accessible and engaging as we possibly can? And that's different for today than how I would have taught this particular session a couple of years ago. So I want to share some slides with you today to sort of go through my presentation. And I'm going to begin that screen share now and invite you to follow along with me as we go through this presentation. I know one of the things that can often happen is that you lose out on who the person is. So who's speaking. So I know that my photo is still there. You can see me up there as I speak. There will be moments when I'll stop the share so that we can talk a little bit longer, or I may forget to do that, and it may be just a screen that you're going to be able to see. Sorry, somehow I got muted. I believe Dr. Suzanne Duchesne is going to share some of the presentation pieces, and this is all being recorded, so you'll have access to it later. So one of the things that several people, as we started today, mentioned was Zoom fatigue. Just serendipitously, I had this as one of my first slides today for us to talk about. The truth is that everybody is exhausted. Everything we do, from this event to our worship services, to our Bible study, to our council meetings, to our classwork, if you're a seminary student, or any conference or synodical sort of gatherings, we're tired of Zoom. This week has been especially high for me. I typically run about 14 to 17 hours a week on Zoom. And this week, teaching a class at New Brunswick, which I thoroughly enjoyed, in doing my own class at ULS and all the other things that had to happen. I'm in hour 28 of Zoom this week. And I got to tell you that staying on when the other speakers are going to be speaking is not something I'm going to do today. I'm going to watch the tape later, and I apologize to my other presenters, but we're all tired. And so we think about going in and doing church, and how do we envision that with an entire people who are exhausted and tired of doing Zoom? And that means that we have to have that hour or that 45 minutes or that hour and a half be as engaging as we possibly can, to ask for lively participation in the music and the reading, even though they may be muted, to read in response, to pick possibilities for us to show images from our congregations. I'll share a little bit about that in a little bit, so that it is as interactive as it can be, even as a flat screen that many people are watching. So what does it mean to begin preaching? I am a professor that has talked in books and in lectures and presentations all across the country that context is the most important thing that we come to in worship and in preaching and liturgy. The phrase in real estate is the most important thing in real estate is location, 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 right? And in preaching and worship, the most important thing is context, context, context. And no matter how long you've been a preacher or how limited time you have been a preacher, no matter your sort of comfort level with technology, your comfort level with what's going on in the world around us, our context has dramatically changed. And it has shifted on a couple of different layers over the last year. Much of that has been caused by and is a result of the pandemic and the restrictions to gathering and all of the illness and sort of weariness around that. It has changed because of the health crisis that is a part of our country today, where some folks have greater access to being treated for their disease than others. It has shifted tremendously in the midst of that time when we were so isolated and alone because of lockdowns. We also had one of the largest participatory moments of Black Lives Matter after the killing of George Floyd. When you put all that into the context today and all that has happened over the last year, you have to also add the financial crisis, the working shifts that have happened, the pivots of businesses from in-person to virtual, the possibilities that many of our folks who are participating with us in worship no longer have employment or no longer have the employment that they used to have, that they are sitting in their homes or venturing out very little during some of those lockdown periods, and they're missing the connections that they have with others. I have not seen my family in person in Texas since December of 2019, and it's been very hard, but I have family, particularly my dad, who's ill, and I just couldn't risk taking anything home with him. My parents have both been vaccinated now. I will receive my next vaccination, my second vaccination later this month. And in April, I am flying home to see them. But that time of not being present with them, of being away, half a country away, when my dad was going through multiple surgeries for cancer, has been weighing on me. So it's not just the weariness of the world, it's also the weariness of our own bones, the weariness of our own sort of context and our own personhood. So when I talk about context for preaching, I'm talking about multiple levels of context to understand who we're preaching to and where they are. And so we can't say, I see you sitting here today. We have to say, I imagine the Mulherns sitting right here, and I imagine the Deutschleys sitting right here. And I have talked to them this week, and they have shared these things with me. And to understand that context is different, and that who you were preaching to February of 2019 and 2020 is a different group than you're preaching to now. And being aware of the shifts and the changes. You have to know your own stuff. What is your context? If you're preaching at home in front of a green screen with the image of your congregation behind you so that folks can see you in that context, that's changed for you. If you're preaching with a live stream from your sanctuary, maybe in a hybrid model with some folks there and some folks on the screen, that's a very different context than probably you used to have. And so knowing those things and determining whether that is a live service or a simulated live going up at your worship hour or everything pre-recorded, that impacts you as a preacher. It impacts you spiritually, emotionally, physically. And so understanding that as we prepare to preach is going to be a really important thing. Always in preaching, we have to understand the context of the text as we begin to preach, to do that exegetical work, to put the work in, so that message becomes vital and vibrant and is prepared for our people for the day and the moment that they're in. And understanding the context of the world over the last year, if we did not name the pain and the suffering of our siblings of color, if we do not name the violence that has happened to our Black and brown brothers and sisters, our siblings of color, and the pain that gets enacted, the pain that gets forced upon those persons who are marginalized, who are excluded often, who are less able to access technology to even join us for worship. If we're not talking about all of that pain, if we're not owning that, then, I think we're not understanding the context of the world. My worship changed during Black Lives Matter. I had always preached and proclaimed the welcome and affirmation of all persons, but the way that hit us, it changed some of our preaching. And if it hasn't changed yours yet, I invite you to think about understanding the context of the world, maybe a little more deeply. And so let's just talk about preaching for a moment. Most written communication is supposed to be read. When you're writing a paper, when you're writing a newsletter article, when you're writing, a draft article for some magazine or journal that you're working with, it is written to be read. The vast majority of our writing is written for a professor or a congregant or somebody to read. A sermon shouldn't be written that way. It should be written to be heard, to be spoken. And there's a distinct difference between those two things. And the document, the written communication that is more set up to be read, you want your syntax perfect. You want those sentences to be perfected within an inch of their life. You want those transitions to be clear and distinct. You want to make sure you use the perfect phrase to get your point across. And often we stilt that at a higher sort of level of academic writing or theological writing than the vast majority of our people. So it means maybe crafting instead of writing sermons, right? It may mean that there is some written word that is really important to us, but we need to think about our context. Are these blue collar folks? Are these white collar folks? Are they a mix of the two? Are they well educated? Are they, less educated? How do I make sure that the words that I use are hearable in colloquial language, in the words that people would understand. Maybe shifting and reading through your sermon and saying, would a fifth grader understand this? Right? Would an eighth grader understand this? Would someone that has limited biblical knowledge understand what I'm saying? And there's such a breadth of folks who are watching worship services today than used to. We'd have 225, 250 in our sanctuary over our couple of services every Sunday. And right now we're having like 350 to 400 individual views on Facebook and on our website. That doesn't even take into account how many people are in a room watching at the same time. So every Sunday, my context is changing a little bit, and I'm getting messages from people all over the country that are joining us for worship. And I'm like, oh man, I don't know the Pacific Northwest. How do I make sure that I'm aware of what's going on out there? So our context is shifting continuously. And if we don't speak in a way that people can hear us and understand us, then we're just reading something for them. And they didn't come to worship to be read to. They didn't join us in this moment online to hear a theological paper. For those of you who are preachers or students and you believe that is a part of your calling, that you're going to be moving into a proclamation moment, I want you just to think, how do I move out of that academic theological language into language that folks can understand? And I'm going to say something that may offend some of you. Your people don't care, for the most part. They just don't care how much Greek you know. Your people don't really care how much Hebrew that you know. Your seminary wanted you to know, and maybe even your conference and your call committee and you know the ordination pieces that you've gone through, they want to know that you've gotten all this information. But what your people want to know is not how much you know, but how much you care. And so a sermon that is carefully crafted for their ears instead of written with a theological sort of read effect is going to be a huge pivot that some of you may still need to make. And it's a big, big part of how I teach preaching. Let's just talk basics. Sermon needs three things. It needs to have unity around one subject, around one topic. Typically for my tradition around one text. You may have additional text read, but for unity, it needs to have a clear, complete, concise reality. What is that 10 to 12 word thing that I can use, sentence that I can use to describe what my sermon is about? Some people call that focus. Some people call that your message theme. And it's that, what do I want to say? What is this one thing that I want to say in this sermon? And then you've got to know why you want to say it and who is going to be listening to it. You want some sort of flow. It wants to flow naturally. And if you're speaking in your own speaking voice and with the syntax and the common sort of phrasing and stuff, that's going to be even more readily accepted. And you want that order to flow, for it to feel like you're moving from one thing to the next, that they see the trajectory of where you're going. And what that means is you got to have a destination. If you're flying this plane, which is your sermon, where are you going to land? What is that core theological concept that you want to get across with this particular sermon for that day? And so some just really, I think some important points that I want to lift up for you today is to be authentic, relational, and personal. One of the things that I miss a lot about sort of COVID preaching right now is that I don't get that interaction, that feedback from folks. Some of that, you all know, is sort of fake and it's half-handed, right? And so you stand at the back of the sanctuary pre-COVID, folks would leave and they'd say, "Oh, great sermon today, Pastor. Oh, I really liked your sermon today, Pastor." Some people would come by and go, "Yeah, that was pretty good. I didn't understand some of that." All of you get those Sundays when there's good and bad that's going on. And I appreciate physical contact. I'm a hugger. I always ask if it's okay, and I don't initiate at church. If somebody says, hey, can I give you a hug? I often will say yes. I like that physicality. That's who I am, within reason and having appropriate boundaries. Not having that feedback, that relational, personal sort of interaction in the midst of preaching and in the midst of worship, I miss. And so trying to figure out how I can be myself on the screen in the sanctuary, whether I'm doing Bible study by Zoom or a council meeting on Zoom, or I'm doing a webinar for different organizations and groups and seminaries across the country, I try to be myself in all of those situations, to be authentically me. I'm from Texas. I am a Texas Tech Red Raider through and through, but soccer is my favorite sport. I love action movies. If I am in a bad mood or have had a tough week, I want to go to the movie theater, sit back in a recliner, have some popcorn, and watch stuff explode. And it's one of those things I've missed so much lately because that's very problematic. It's very hard to do that. So I have to be who I am. And so sometimes I use those personal stories, those accounts from movies that I love, and to let my energy and my enthusiasm and my passion for what I do and what I talk about be so upfront that people say, yep, that's the Karyn we know everywhere, right? And when I'm teaching to be myself as authentically as I can be in the midst of that, I don't take on a preacher voice or a professor voice. This is how I talk. This is who I am. And so in any of those contexts, it's typically who I'm going to be, even in academic context where I'm presenting a paper somewhere. I still got to be me, right? The old Popeye thing. I am what I am. I am who I am. And that's what I want preachers to be. I want them to be their authentic selves. So the second point on this, I just got to acknowledge this again. This is not the moment to be reading a sermon into a camera. Use as few notes as you possibly can. Make sure you're giving eye contact with that camera and not with the manuscript. And, this has been true all along. It's something I have taught from the beginning of my career, that one of the things that we have to do is get up and into a relational, participatory, collaborative environment as we preach. When we're in our sanctuaries, we're up on an elevated platform, transept, and we've got maybe a big pulpit in front of us, and we've got a page with all of our, with our manuscript or with our notes or whatever, and we have usually some sort of fencing of the transept, the raised area. Then we got a few feet until we get to the altar rail, more, 4 to 6 feet before we get to the first pew, and then we've got maybe 6 rows before we get to a live person. That's a lot of stuff to overcome. When we're in worship, it's in person. Well, then we imagine, what does that look like when I'm doing it by screen? Then we have to get past everything that is an obstacle to us being connected intimately, relationally, authentically with the people who are in our congregations, in their homes, or in this hybrid setup, some there and some on the screen. So I need to name this. It's a huge part of my teaching. I want people to get as far away from the manuscript as they can. If you still need a manuscript, recraft it into language that is short bursts of information, then has some sort of connective tissue, a theme, a repetitive word, or the use of a certain biblical text, or maybe it is an image that sort of begins in that and ends as you go through that sermon, where you have a trajectory and you know where you're going to land that plane and where you want them to see it. So find ways to just be as connected as you possibly can be. and do that in ways that are important. I have a friend that when they're in person, they have a whiteboard that's in the front pew, and they write sort of the major points, the sort of key words of their sermon. Nobody else sees it because no one's up there on the front pew, but it allows them not to look down at something, but to be up and visible. One of the things you can do is make sure that if you're recording, that your eye level with whatever you're reading is the same as where you're recording. So have that script, have the outline or those notes right there so you're as relational as possible. Speak the truth, even when your voice shakes. Speak the truth. When we have something as a culture, as a country that we have to address, racism, inequality in schools and in work relationships, when we have the issues around racial violence and police violence, when we have folks who are not just losing their jobs, but losing their homes and losing their livelihoods, and saying goodbye to multiple family members from this pandemic, and we're not speaking about those things, we're not preaching. We got to name the pain. We have to name the reality and the truth that's going on in this moment. And the truth that's going on in this moment is that I said earlier on that I was going to be able to go home because I've had my first shot. But who are the people who are receiving those shots the least right now? It's people of color. I live with a woman who is completely immune compromised, and we were able to get a shot early. She has not been able to go to work. She has not been able to go shop. She has not been able to do very many things, and that is painful. She also is susceptible. So being able to get a shot was a great blessing to us. But at the same time, I kept thinking, man, we had access to that and others don't. And it weighed on me, the decision of whether or not to go and get that vaccine. And I know that I have to lift up that my siblings of color have been treated differently this entire time, that our country was built on the backs of our brown and black sisters and brothers and siblings, and that in this moment, the people who are in the most danger, often in healthcare, are the CNAs. They're the hospitality folks. They are the maintenance people. They are the cooks and the cleaners and the folks who are coming into those rooms and have less access to PPE than their higher rated folks in those places. And all of this has to change. So during this time period, if we're not naming that pain, if we're not naming the inequity, if we're not naming what's happening to our siblings who are in such pain and agony right now, they know. They'll come on your YouTube or on your Facebook page and they'll listen to worship. But if you're not naming those things that they're hearing every single day, if you're not talking about the insurrection of January 6th, if you're not talking about kids that have been in cages for years and that are still in them as they try as quickly as they can to get them out of those situations. But we have to name that pain. We have to name that injustice and speak truth to what our siblings are going through all over the country. So let's think about real quickly what helps people listen. And some of this will echo, but I'm saying it again. What helps people listen is having a clear purpose. It's not just in 10 to 12 words what I'm going to say, but it's in 10 to 12 words as well what I want this sermon to accomplish. What is my purpose? Is it to educate the folks who are listening? Is it to challenge the people into a different level of behavior or activism? Is it to comfort folks who are in the midst of grief? Is it to teach a sacramental or a theological concept? You got to know what your purpose is. And if you know those two things, your what and your why, basically, your what you're going to say and why you're going to say it, it changes everything for the listeners because they know it's concise, it's packed. There's one theme that's running throughout this. Being engaging and energetic. I can't sit still. I can't not use my hands. It's who I am. And so if I try to be, this centered person holding on to the pulpit or whatever, and I'm not moving, and all you see is my lips moving, they know you ain't energetic or engaging at that moment. You gotta be engaging. You got to be as present as you possibly can be. Whether you're in the pulpit in a hybrid setting, or if you're back in person already, and on camera. And I know that Jason's going to talk a little bit later on in the day about hybrid situations and how do you do worship with folks present in the room and those people who are present virtually. And I look forward to listening to that presentation a little later on. You got to give them a hook to get into the sermon. You got to give them something. One of the things that preachers were taught was to start off with a joke, a good joke. And I just am going to have to say right now that rarely works. And if you're virtual, you're not going to hear a response from them, whether or not they laughed or got the joke. Give them an image, give them a question, start with a story, and draw them into that. A couple of years ago, I preached a sermon about the snakes of the world, the way that temptation crawls up in and meets us. And I began my sermon by talking about one of the things that we did as children. And I said, I grew up in Levelland, Texas. My dad was a pastor. Our house was on the property next to the church. And we would play hide and go seek. And my dad would say, you can't go in any locked doors at the church, but you can go anywhere else on the property, our house and the parking lot and the trees behind it. You can go and play hide and go seek. So he was there that day, and my mom was out doing something. So the three of us and my dad were playing hide and go seek. And dad is going to seek, and so he's hiding his eyes. And the three of us sort of branch out, myself and my two sisters, and we hide. And I found a place that was the best hiding place ever. It was a platform about 12 feet off the ground that had a ladder going up to it where the external air conditioning systems were. There was 3 huge systems up there. And we had never been up there before. I had never been given permission to go up there before, but I thought, man, I'm going. And so I climbed up those stairs and I crawled in between 2 of the units, and I just sort of sat there for a while. Well, it was probably 90 degrees outside. That area was in the sun, and I fell asleep. I did not get awakened until much later, when my dad, after calling the police, after searching for several hours, saw the ladder at the back of the church and crawled up just a little bit. He looked over the edge, and he saw me laying there asleep. And right between my legs was a coiled up rattlesnake. And I stopped the story. And I moved into the rest of the sermon. And there was this hook that interested them to know what happened. Now, I'm preaching that day, so the rattlesnake didn't kill me. So they know that, but they don't know how that rattlesnake incident was dealt with or handled. And it took a little while for my dad to figure out what to do. He called the police. They came. They found like a flat horizontal spade. And he went up, my dad with the cops right behind him, and he hooked that spade under the edge of the snake's belly, where the snake was a little coiled off. And he knew which way the snake would strike because of where its head was. And so he eased on, and he decided to throw it in the direction that the snake would strike, so that if it struck out, it wouldn't be striking at me. And he got under that thing and he threw it off of me and off of the platform. And I hear a gunshot. And it startles me awake, and it's a police officer that has shot the snake. Now, I'm sorry if you're offended by the snake being shot. At the moment, I didn't even know there was a snake with me. I slept through the entire thing. So talking about that at the beginning of the sermon, getting into some of the meat and some of the issues that I wanted to talk about with the text and the context and, what was happening in the world and where these temptations and these snakes were crawling into us. And then that hope that the snake can be removed, that we can conquer because God is with us. And that sermon, I still hear comments about that sermon years later. It was a hook, and it also had a place for them to go, to something for them to take away. And that's that last point on this slide. You have to end in an invitational manner that invites them to engage the world, engage the word, to do something to make it happen. The other ways that listeners are enabled and encouraged and helped in the listening is if you have a clear and cohesive structure. Maybe that's a bracket sermon, which is what I just described, with a story, the meat of the exegesis and context, and then the ending of that story. Maybe it's an outline where you have 3 specific points. Whatever that is, make sure that that structure is cohesive and that it's clear even to the listeners. Speak with conviction. Don't be timid or tentative. Be bold. God has called you to this moment. God has called you to preach, to proclaim, to sing in the worship service, to be a congregational leader, to be a musician, whoever it is or whatever the role is that you've been called to. God called you to it, and God will get you through it. So know that. Engage with your eyes as much as you possibly can. Be relaxed and open. These are things that I find very, very important. The other thing I want us just to acknowledge in this conversation about preaching is that our culture has shifted significantly. And it wasn't just in 2020. It was in the years before. We used to be an oral culture. Texas in some ways still is. And usually I say I'm proud of my Texas heritage. Over the last month, especially in the last 2 weeks, not particularly excited about my home state. It's very oral. I mean, people tell stories. They tell stories so many times that their friends and their family can repeat the story back to them, or they can finish the story with them. That oral culture is still around, but we moved from that predominantly oral culture into a print culture. With the Gutenberg press, it just changed things. Without that, we would not have had the Reformation, the ability to publish Luther's 95 Theses, the ability to publish sermons and doctrinal statements during that time period enabled a wide audience to be able to see the words and to understand that. Now we're continuing to moving into this electronic and digital culture. And it is enhancing often our relationship with God, and is sometimes makes it a little bit harder. And as I'm thinking about the churches that I'm preaching to, I have to be aware that there are 3 different groups that are sort of participating in our digital worship right now. There are those folks who are digital natives who were absolutely born with a Game Boy in their hand, with a Fisher Price educational game, where they know that from their innate sense of being, they can multiply. They can do multiple screens at one time. They will be playing on a Nintendo Switch, and they've got their laptop on, and they're listening to a lecture or a course requirement, and they're texting with a friend on their phone, and they can do that stuff seamlessly for the most part. We can't make assumptions that these are generational. There are some folks who just have innately been a part of that. I've had uncles and brothers-in-law who have been a part of digital culture in their chemistry work, in their science work, in their employment for decades. So they came to it very easily. There are digital immigrants out there, like myself, came of age in a print age, but have very much embraced now and are a part of social media, technology, digital worship in all different kinds of ways. And we have those folks like my dad, who is a digital Luddite. He has a cell phone. We bought it for $1. When we were buying my mom an upgrade. It was an old model, and he can answer the phone. He doesn't know how to call. And he can press on the button for the one app that he has on his phone, and it's My Gas Buddy. which allows him to push a button and it activates and tells him where the cheapest gas is close to him. And that's where he goes to get his gas. He doesn't have an email. Often he does not take his phone with him. And you've got all three of these constituencies that are a part of your congregation. As you're preaching, you engage them, text me, tweet me, hashtag, check in digitally on Facebook while you're there. So those folks who enjoy that sort of digital reality can participate in that. Have them take a picture of them waving a palm branch or leaves or something and create an iMovie. Or a movie project of all of the images that come in. Have your kids read the scripture by video and digital, put that into your worship service and have all different age groups participating. Let them use the skill level that they have so that worship and preaching can be more participatory and you can take advantage of that. I think it's very important. I know some of my colleagues will say a little bit more, but you got to layer the tech, right? And so there are moments when I simply read out of a leather-bound Bible, and there are other moments when I use my cell phone, and they can see me reading the text off of that or sending a text blast out. Easter 2 years ago, I invited everybody to bring their phones, however they use them, into the worship service and to leave them on. We have extended Wi-Fi in our sanctuary so people can post and they can videotape and do all kinds of stuff. And I invited them at the end of that service or at the end of the sermon to say, hey, there are people who are here today and there are people who aren't. And they need to hear Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Text, Facebook post, tweet, Instagram, whatever your platform is, tell the people who are a part of your community, who are listening right now, who are in, maybe have no church right now. Tell them God loves them and so do you. Tell them that Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. And literally, there were hundreds of texts and Facebook posts that were going out. I had a hashtag, if they knew how to hashtag Gloria Day Easter, and I could click on Twitter or Facebook and see all those tweets and texts and Facebook posts that were going out. And this was pre-pandemic, making sure that we have folks who know technology engage that in a way that makes them feel like, oh yeah, worship is similar to what I do. Worship is where I connect with folks, and these are those opportunities. And one of the things is to know those Luddites. We've had to have a congregational meeting, a congregational call vote for my call to be affirmed at Gloria Day, where I'm the lead pastor. And we had tutorials all week. If you don't know how to use Zoom, call Karyn at this time, and she's going to walk you through it. And we had some folks who joined by phone, some folks who joined by Zoom, some people who didn't know what they were joining by, and we had to sort of help them through that process. But those instructions and tutorials are really great. And we did some of that pre-COVID. We had our seniors, our more experienced members, bring in their laptops or their tablets that they had received and didn't exactly know how to use. And our youth group did a training afternoon, and they helped them figure out how to sign up for email, how to join Facebook if they wanted to, how to text. And we had I think we had 12 youth there, and we had 41 folks who had never been able to really figure out how to use their technology come to church on a Sunday afternoon and learn how to do that. And those folks, this was pre-COVID, remember, those folks are now joining us on Zoom for meetings, joining us on Zoom for our Bible studies, and they're joining us, being able to know now how to access email where we send out notices. But we also know that we have those Luddites, and so we have a printed package piece that goes out every single week to about 25 different addresses of people who we know don't have that capacity. I do not preach from a manuscript, but I do have an outline that goes out in that mailing, a bulletin that goes out, and we also send some thoughts for the day, some prayers for the day. Sometimes there is maybe a sign-up sheet if you want to order Easter flowers or something, and there's usually some sort of little bookmark or something that just goes in that envelope, and we send that out every single week. But we also do thoughts, and we do prayer solicitations, and we do all these different things through Facebook and through our Instagram account. And that makes it possible for us to reach all those different constituencies. So make sure that you're aware of those 3 different groups and figure out ways that you can get all of them in. So a couple more things, and then I'll end in about 10 minutes, and we'll answer some questions. So as you're thinking over the next 10 minutes or so, think if there are questions that you want to pose, and you can go on the Q&A, which is on your tools site, and type those questions in. So the characteristics of digital preaching. I think one of the great things that we can do with digital preaching is to crowdsource. To go on Facebook or on a texting app or even through email to say, I'm going to be preaching on what God's grace looks like. Tell me what grace looks like to you, or just do, hey, preaching question. How have you experienced grace, and how did it feel to you to receive that grace? Maybe you're going to be talking about the fears that we have in the world, and send out a poll on your Facebook page or on Twitter. What are you most afraid of? And give them some examples like spiders or snakes or death or cancer or being alone. And you can let that stuff sort of source your preaching and source the way you think about stuff. And of course, in digital preaching, you've got to constantly be sensitive to the shifting and changing moments. We used to be able to write our sermons through the week, show up on Sunday, and often we didn't think about whether or not we needed to read the newspaper. There is a quote attributed to Karl Barth, not substantial proof that he actually said it, but we continue to use it. But a preacher preaches with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And speaking of digital preaching, we have the Bible and the newspaper right in our hands, in our cell phones, on our laptops, on our tablets. There are moments that during the song before our prayer time, I open up my Facebook and see if anyone else has listed a prayer. I ask every Friday or Saturday on Facebook, what are your prayers for the week? And that's what shapes how I write my prayers for that week. But I also look and see if there's anything new. I also go on an app that gives me a succinct synopsis of the biggest stories that are happening in that particular moment. So I know if something has happened. I try to do as much as I can before I go to worship on those days, just to, has there been a hurricane? Has there been a typhoon? Has there been a mass shooting event? Has there been an instance of police violence? What are those things that I want to bring into the worship moment so that folks know I'm praying with you about, a 50-car pileup in the fog or on the ice. I'm praying with you about a high school football team that had a car accident on the way home. I'm praying with you about a national event that's going on around us. I think you also need to understand that whatever you're using digitally, whether that is Zoom or a live stream on YouTube, or we use Boxcast as our live stream app because we can send it to all of our social media accounts at the very same time, so that people can watch it on our website through our Boxcast system, or they can go on Facebook or Instagram and watch the service from those platforms. But we got to continue to think about, how does this further the gospel? in some moments, maybe that doesn't further the gospel as well. It's just the fundamental need. But maybe inviting participation and collaboration and kids participating in ways that maybe you can't right now with only virtual is the only way you can do that. How does that further the gospel? And one of the things I learned early on is that when we make generational assumptions about older folks being Luddites and all the younger folks being either natives or immigrants, there's inaccuracy in that. I've got a cousin. He is a younger cousin than I am. He's 24 years old. He doesn't have a cell phone. He doesn't have a Facebook account or a Twitter account. He doesn't go on TikTok. None of those things. He just does not want to be a part of it. Mainly when we talk about Luddites, a lot of folks think older generations, right? Those who are, 70 and older. And that's not a good assumption as well. I told you my dad has a cell phone and he doesn't know how to use it. My mom has a Kindle. She has a laptop. She has her email address. She's on Instagram. She Snapchats. She texts us on a regular basis. And that's an amazing thing. She's 85 years old and she is as present in those categories as some of my, my cohort, my age and younger. So don't make assumptions about digital preaching. Figure out how you reach all those different constituencies. And that's just what I want you to hear. This is a new day. And preaching in this new environment is totally different for a lot of us than it ever was before. And the way that we pivot, right? I started with that word pivot. The way we pivot to different platforms or different possibilities around that core value, that axis that says we want to proclaim the gospel of the good news of Jesus Christ. We want to help people understand the grace and love and compassion that is a part of who we are as communities of faith, as Christians, that we want to use word and music and liturgy and sacraments and all the things that we can to propel the gospel of the good news. That is what we're called to do, no matter what the time is, pre-COVID, post-COVID, it doesn't matter. Our pivot point has to be around the proclamation of the good news. Timothy Wingert, longtime member of our faculty, Dr. Timothy Wingert, noted theologian, has written the book on Luther and Lutheran theology. He used to say to his students, no matter what you do with the theology you learn in my class and the Christian ed you learn in someone else's class and the preaching and liturgy that you learn from a third class, it has to be about Jesus. It has to be about Jesus Christ, born, raised, teaching, baptized, healing, crucified, buried, and risen from the dead. If all that we do is around that pivot, that's the core of the gospel. That's who we're supposed to be. And what Tim Wingert would say to his students is, just preach the damn gospel. Just preach the damn gospel. It's right there. The gospel of God's grace, the gospel of the resurrected Christ, the gospel of a spirit that empowers and engages all of our senses so that we can proclaim that gospel. If we center everything on that pivot point that is the proclamation of Jesus Christ, that it is the sharing of God's love through the Messiah, man, we won't go wrong. If we pivot what we do around that core value that Jesus Christ is the center of all that we do, it changes things. Now, there are other faith traditions and there are other religions that have a different pivot point. And I honor all of their pivot points as well. But for me, as a Christian, as a disciple of Jesus Christ, as a ordained person in the UCC, previously in the United Methodist Church, teaching an ELC seminary and the lead pastor in ELCA congregation, I am what is probably called a denominational mutt. I got a lot of it in me. I've got all these different things. And sometimes mutts are the best. They're the best dogs. I'm a denominational mutt, but in every one of those, the core of what I do is preaching the gospel and teaching others to preach the gospel. So what I hope you heard today was the permission to try some new things. What I hope you heard today was an affirmation that what you're doing is exhausting and that you have to continue to do that in ways that care for yourself and care for your community in all the ways that you possibly can. I want you to hear today that you have a changing, shifting constituency that you're constantly having to read differently. Know yourself, know your people, and know that what you're proclaiming is a gospel of grace and love. And if I helped you center a little bit on that today, then that is a blessing to me. And I hope that it enriches you. And we're going to open up in just a minute for you to share some questions, some insights, what you heard today and what you still want to hear as we move forward. Thank you very much for your attention today. I know it's a long day, lots of stuff going on, and your presence to me was just a godsend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Wiseman. So many important points, so many helpful practical tools that I think will work now if we're fully online and for the future of hybrid worship. So thank you. I'm sure everyone is just clapping hands and saying thank you right now. Just some logistics on the Zoom webinar again. Please send your chat messages to everyone if you're commenting and you want to speak with everyone. You can always private chat with me if you're having technical difficulties or issues. So Suzanne Duchesne, just look for me and use the Q&A section again for your questions. And we do have some questions that have come in, Dr. Wiseman. So
all right.
Here we go. One of our first questions was, because I'm a digital Luddite, on that screen you use the letters SM. What does that mean?
Oh, yeah, that's social media, right? So one of the things that has bloomed in the last 20, 30 years, but particularly in the last 20 years, is our ability to connect to people over social platforms. I should have said more about that early on. I apologize. I named a few of those. I think the most common platforms, social media platforms that folks are using as congregations and personally is Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, TikTok. These are either word-driven social media sites where I can go on and post my thoughts, or I can post a question, or I can post a picture of my dog to brighten. I don't have a dog, but if people will post pictures of their dog and say, "Hey, this is a cool thing," or you might be inviting your congregation on their Facebook apps to tag themselves, to locate themselves worshiping with your community. You can do a lot of things with those, but you can also proclaim the gospel, not knowing a dang thing about TikTok or FaceTime or Twitter or Instagram. It's an additional sort of digital way of branching out what you have. So some of you may be just doing, and that's fine, a digital service on Sunday morning. You either do it live on your platform or you do it pre-taped that you load to that platform, YouTube or Facebook or whatever that goes live at that particular time. But you can also engage your people outside of the worship time through either Facebook. Our congregation really doesn't use Twitter. I use Twitter a lot personally, which is sharing information and insights and commenting on news and posts. But our church doesn't. The vast majority of our people use Facebook and they use Instagram. And so Instagram is image driven. And so I will say, hey, we're ready for you guys this morning. And I will post a picture of the sanctuary empty just to say, this is how you're going to come, but we're ready for you. Or I'll post a snippet of a song that I record during the band practice time. And I'll post that. And you can do Facebook Live and and do a brief, like 2 to 3 minute reflection. I do that about once every 10 days to 2 weeks. Sometimes they're 2 or 3 minutes. Sometimes they're like 5 or 6 minutes. You also can invite people. You can, again, on that phone, put it like you're going to do a selfie and look at it like it's a mirror, right? A lot of people struggle with selfies, but let me just tell you, if you were holding a handheld mirror, you would have your face in that mirror, right? You would hold it that way that your face would be there. So on your phone, look at it. Tell it to flip around and to do a selfie. And you can record something like, hey, this Sunday, we're going to talk about Jesus. He's turning over tables this week and he has this righteous anger. And oh my gosh, are we going to talk about that Sunday? Join us live at 10 o'clock on our Facebook or website. And you can join us after that if you're not able to do that. And you post that on your Facebook account, on your church page. If you're one of those Luddites and you don't have a lot of those platforms, you can still and are doing valuable and important work. But thinking about other ways to engage your congregation, to engage this group of people who may not be present throughout the week, it's those multiple touches throughout the week, multiple contacts throughout the week that keeps your congregants and folks engaged so that they're ready and prepared and excited about coming in different times of the week as well. All right. Hope that answered that question. All right.
Great. Hang on here. It was mentioned that preachers can use a teleprompter behind their camera. What thoughts do you have about that?
Yeah, there's a bunch of voice-activated apps now that there's Teleprompter Pro, things like that are there, and you can set that next to the camera, and it will move at the speed of your voice. Right? You can set it for faster or slower. You can practice it. Some of these apps you can find on your Apple Store or on your App Store or on other device types platforms. And you just start Googling. Some of them are free. I wouldn't use some of the free ones. They often have a bunch of stuff that comes with it. Some of them are as little as $12 or $15. Some of them are as much as $40. But try one, get a free trial of one and test. And so what you do is you upload, if you've written a manuscript, you upload it here, right, onto that app. And then as you speak, as you're reading it, not the whole time, you know some of it, so you're not having to read word for word, it will move at the speed of your voice. And so you can glance, you could even, if you're on a laptop like I am, and I have the camera at the top of my screen, I could underlay underneath that my sermon on a teleprompter, and I can watch that. There are also some apps that will project it onto a screen, so you could have a screen next to the camera and you could use it that way. Every barrier that you break up, that you eliminate between you and the engagement of your audience in the most important way, I would use those options in every way you can. Okay.
Okay. Excellent. Another question that came in is, would preaching at the 5th grade level preclude the possibility of elevating the discourse? Are we reducing our preaching to the lowest common denominator? Without engaging in academic writing, should we strive for a higher level of understanding, move away from the infantile Bible story to meaning behind the story?
Yeah, and I'm talking about language, right? I'm talking about language for the most part. Absolutely, you're using theological content. You're doing the research that you have, but it's context, right? So if I'm preaching in one context that is an older generation that doesn't really go to the movies anymore, like my 11 o'clock service at the church, they have not used a screen in their sanctuary except maybe 3 times, and I've forced them since I've been here the last couple of years to use it. But they are on Zoom and they are coming in and using that apparatus now, that possibility. For them, they have an experience level that I have to honor. So at my 9:30 contemporary service, I may talk about the latest movie. I may talk about a YouTube trend, or I might talk about a comedy series, or I might go back then in my 11 o'clock service and use a different sort of way to move into that conversation. In everything I said today was for you to engage the context. So in no way am I saying don't talk at a level that sort of raises the discourse of what's happening today. What I'm saying is the language we use, I think, needs to be as accessible as possible. And for me, grew up in the church with a dad who was sort of folksy and told stories. And, when he did Jacob and Esau, he did Harry and Grabby. One was Harry and one was a grabber. And they had pork and beans and they went out to the sheep fields because that matched in his Texas context. But then you move into these really deep theological, social, cultural things that are going on around us. And the discourse, the word you used a while ago, absolutely appropriate. The discourse that's happening out in the secular world is combative. It's binary. It's confrontational. It is anger-filled and hate-filled in many situations. And so mimicking that would be totally inappropriate. Telling it at a level that everyone can sort of understand what's going on, and then sharing some discourse that's important, I think, in a way that's very approachable. I remember the rule in our house. If we were having people over, we didn't talk about religion or politics. And I've heard that phrase all of my life, and it has done us a significant disservice. We ought to be talking about religion. We ought to be talking about politics in ways that invite us to listen to dissenting and differing opinions, that allows us to figure out, how do I say these things in a way that is less combative and less confrontational and more on a level of, I want to hear how you mean that phrase that you just used. Can you help me understand what that means for your relationships, right? So absolutely talk about the cultural events of the day. Make sure that you're elevating the discourse in a way that is grace-filled, that is love-filled and focused, and that is transformational in ways that help folks see where God is in these moments, and how our theology, our understanding of the world and our relationships with each other is done in a way that honors the discourse, but also shares it at a level that folks can understand. I hope that answers the question, because I by no means want you to dumb things down. What I want you to do is make sure that even the difficult and complex theological and cultural conversations that you have in your preaching is done in a way that folks can understand it, that it's not being elevated into this high theological language that sometimes is hard for people to follow. So know your context, because that's certainly going to help guide you in the ways that you're going to deal with this. All right.
Yep. And along those lines, then you mentioned national, global, major current events, and they were asking what app it is that you use for that.
I have a Smart News app, and I also have, what's the other one? It's Flipboard, and those things on my phone, Flipboard and Smart News, they do a succinct sort of a couple of lines on each news story that's going on. I also have a local app that is, oh gosh, I can't remember what it's called, but it's the neighborhood app where you can click in your neighborhood, and I put in Montgomery County or Huntingdon Valley. And I can see quite quickly if anything has happened in my particular county or in my city. And sometimes, I don't want to go to CNN and MSNBC, and to be honest, I wouldn't go to Fox News, but I go to sites where I feel like there's a little more commonality, a little more collegial, sort of less biased. I go on BBC. I go on, I'm trying to remember all of them, but there's a couple of places that I go. But those apps that are sort of aggregators of the news, they sort of aggregate, they gather and then collect it into one place. Then I try to make sure that is as unbiased as possible. But as we know, the media today, it is more entertainment than it is news, and it is more, pounding it into us every 15 minutes than actually sharing news stories in ways that don't drive us up the wall. Since the election, I was having very difficult time watching the news, and before the election, and January 6th sort of snapped me out of it, and I went back into sort of my news sourcing, and I talked about January 6th. I talked about the ways that we are not listening to each other, that the violence is erupting. I talked about the inappropriateness of attacking the seat of our democracy. And I got a tiny bit of pushback. I typically do. My congregation is progressive, and that's where they are. I just think making sure you're aware of what's going on. I came into church one time in my very first congregation, very rural congregation. Didn't have, there wasn't a newspaper. I had a home phone, and I walked in, and everyone was sort of sitting there, and they looked like they had been traumatized. They were crying, they were weeping, they were crying out, and I was like, "What in the world happened?" And one of our members, the chair of our council, and his wife, and our church treasurer and his wife had gone away for the weekend and were coming back because they felt like they wanted to be there for church because they couldn't get an usher to take one of their place. And they lost control of the vehicle. Hit a culvert and went into an underpass, and all four of them were killed instantly. And I didn't know that. They did because family members called each other. And I walked in and said, "Church can't be what I planned for today." We prayed. We sat there and talked about our memories. So knowing what's happening around us, both locally, around the corner and around the world, I think can really enrich your preaching because it shows that you're contextually centered on what's happening in the world, and you're getting into that fourth level of context, and that's what happens in the world around us. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Wiseman. Thank you. We have got a number of questions for you. So I would like to ask, with your permission, would you be willing for me to send those on to you that you could answer those? We could give them your email. You could contact.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wiseman. So much to learn.